Welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. Each week we feature an episode from the best independent creators. Hit subscribe for more great true crime content. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you about Scary Time, another podcast by Indie Drop-In featuring independent creators. If you like episodes about the paranormal, ghosts, monsters, hauntings, creepy places, enchanted objects, aliens, and more, check out Scary Time. You can find Scary Time in any podcast app, or you can click the link in the show notes below. All right, let's get to today's true crime episode. Today's episode is from the True Crime Cat Lawyer. Now, you might remember the True Crime Cat Lawyer from the awesome Halloween episode she provided. Well, Elise is back for a true crime episode. The True Crime Cat Lawyer is a podcast hosted by a lawyer and her kitty, focusing on cases from the Pacific Northwest. If you like this episode from the True Crime Cat Lawyer, check out the show notes for links to subscribe and follow on social media. Enjoy the show.
Begin. The Oracle Network.
Talentless Talent! It's me, your host, Kylie Dills. Talentless Talent is a podcast about those with extraordinary talent. We're talking about conspiracy theories. We're talking to comedians. We're talking to painters. We are talking to those who make portraits. We're talking to dollhouse makers. We are talking to people about sports. We're talking to comedians, we're talking to sex workers, we're talking to models, we're talking to videographers. We have it all, including a very special pickle time. Talentless Talent is hosted by me, Kylie Dills, somebody who has no talent. So be sure to tune it in every Thursday. I'll catch you there, my Talentless Talent babes. We're having a good time.
Talentless Talent.
Talentless Talent.
It's Talentless Talent.
Talentless Talent with Kylie Dills.
Hello, and welcome back to True Crime Cat Lawyer. I'm your host, Elise, joined by my co-host, Winston the Cat. Every other week, Winston and I will bring you a new story about a murder, disappearance, or serial killer with a special focus on cases from our hometown, the Pacific Northwest. Just a reminder, this podcast contains content of a graphic nature that might not be suitable for all listeners, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, and crimes against animals and children. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 25th episode. Not only is today our 25th episode, but it's also the 1-year anniversary of True Crime Cat Lawyer. Winston and I are so grateful for everyone who has listened to and supported the show over the past year. We are so lucky to be part of an amazing network, and we've had the opportunity to meet and work with some fantastic podcasts. We can't wait to keep bringing you more content in the future. In case you don't follow us on social media, we have a couple of exciting announcements for the month of August. First, all proceeds from our ad in the month of August will be donated to the Oregon Humane Society in the form of a cat sponsorship. Winston and I will tally up the total at the end of the month and be sure to let you guys know the amount we're donating and the cat we're sponsoring. Our second announcement is an awesome exclusive perk for all new patrons who join our Patreon at any level. If you join the $1, $3, or $5 tier in the month of August, we'll send you an exclusive cat person pin. These pins were designed especially for our patrons, and they're so cute. Perfect for showing off your support for the show. Our final announcement is another exclusive Patreon perk for those of you who'd like to join at the $5 tier. In addition to the True Crime Cat Lawyer sticker pack that we normally send, for the month of August only, we're also giving our $5 patrons an anniversary gift pack. In this gift pack, there's a True Crime Cat Lawyer keychain, a Cat Person button, a True Crime Cat Lawyer button, and a bunch of Patreon exclusive stickers, including large Winston Wednesday and Cat Person stickers. You can head over to patreon.com/truecrimecatLawyer to find out more information. Okay, with all of that housekeeping taken care of, let's get into today's insane case. Today's case takes place in Pacific County, Washington, which is northwest from Seattle near the coast of Washington. This is the case of Michelle Knotek. Michelle Knotek was the daughter of a high school track and football star and a quote-unquote depressive alcoholic. Michelle's father, Les, was a big deal in the city of Battleground. He eventually came to own a bowling alley and 2 nursing homes with his mother. Michelle's mother, Sharon, she just couldn't take care of her and Les's kids. In 1960, Sharon had Les and his second wife, Laura, take the older kids, and she kept her baby, Paul. Once Sharon was gone, it was like she never existed. In the spring of 1967, the LA County Sheriff's Department knocked on Les and Laura's door to inform them that Sharon had been murdered. At the time of her death, Sharon was homeless, living on Skid Row with her boyfriend. The only detail police provided was that Sharon had been beaten to death. They handed over baby Paul to Les and Laura. No one really seemed to care after Sharon passed away. The older kids weren't really that close to Sharon, and Paul was a baby, so it wouldn't be long before he forgot all about her. Plus, Laura, Les's second wife, really embraced the children as her own and was a great stepmother. But all the love and support from a good stepmother couldn't fix what was already brewing in Michelle. Michelle, who was better known as Shelley to her friends and family, was a very difficult child. She was incredibly dramatic, nothing satisfied her, and she resented her brothers, which of course can be common for some siblings. But this was different. Shelley was dark and vengeful. Shelley spent a lot of time with her paternal grandma, Anna, and Anna was not a good role model for her granddaughter. Anna was described as a quote-unquote cruel queen, mostly because she tortured those who worked for her and lived with her. For example, she made her own husband, George, sleep in an 8x8 shed near the back door of the house. Her husband. Shelley would learn all of her torture techniques from Grandma Anna. Shelley was Grandma Anna's protege. They were, quote, inseparable, constant companions, end quote. In March 1969, Shelley was taken to a juvenile detention center, but not because of anything she'd done per se. Shelley accused her father of raping her, so her school principal had sent her to the juvenile facility while they investigated the claim. The story had been entirely fabricated by Shelley. In the process of the investigation, her parents, Les and Laura, found out that Shelley had taken the story from one that she had read in a magazine. She never explained why she made up this story about her dad, but Les was incredibly hurt. Not only was the story totally false, Les was well known in his community, and he was a prominent member of that community. Shelley's accusation could have ruined his career and his reputation. After the investigation turned up nothing, Shelley was released, but only on the condition that she get counseling. But that was hard to do. Shelley was stubborn, and Les and Laura couldn't make her do anything she didn't want to do. Her parents tried everything with Shelley, but they just couldn't deal with her. They had 2 kids together, plus Shelley's brothers to raise, and Shelley was a huge strain on their relationship. Les wasn't around a lot because of work, but when he was around, he spoiled Shelley. He gave her everything she wanted. Shelley was his princess. Even though she had falsely accused him of rape, buying her things to placate her and quote-unquote make her happy was Les's way of dealing with Shelley. Poor Laura was stuck disciplining or trying to discipline Shelley, and eventually she had to send Shelley to Hoodsport to live with her parents. Finally, a reprieve for the tired parents. By the time Shelley moved in with her step-grandparents, she had been kicked out of multiple schools. Shelley eventually ended up going to live with her aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania, when her step-grandparents got tired of her. She met her first husband, Randy Rivardo, in the summer of 1971 when they were both in high school. Shelley eventually moved back to Washington to work for less as a nurse's aide in one of his nursing homes. Shelley and Randy got married in February of 1971 when they were both just 19. The couple moved into a trailer rent-free, but Shelley was unhappy. She was eventually fired by her dad because she was a serial absentee. And even though she was living on her own and was married to her husband, she would still throw fits and get so upset when her dad didn't buy her whatever she wanted. She even tried to overdose on sleeping pills and alcohol after her dad didn't buy her the car she wanted. He literally bought her a car, but because it wasn't the Volkswagen Bug that she wanted, she decided she would overdose on sleeping pills. Shortly after this overdose, Shelley made claims of a rape and attack while she was in the trailer alone one night. When the sheriffs came to investigate, they said that the wounds were self-inflicted. But after this little incident, Shelley made her husband move them into this cute little house because she was too afraid to stay alone in the trailer. So basically, she got exactly what she wanted. She didn't want to be in this trailer, so she concocted some story and even created injuries to herself just to get her husband to move where she wanted to move. In the summer of 1974, Shelley got pregnant. Her daughter Nikki was born in February of 1975. Despite this pregnancy and their beautiful daughter Nikki, Randy and Shelley weren't doing great. Money was incredibly tight because Shelley just took Randy's paychecks and would spend them on whatever she felt like spending them on. It got so bad that Randy would end up sleeping in his car. He eventually left Shelley and Nikki and filed for divorce. After her first marriage dissolved, Shelley disappeared for about a year. She left Nikki with her stepmom Laura and just took off. Literally nobody knew where she was or what she was doing for almost an entire year. She did eventually come back and get Nikki, but she would continue to keep gifts and letters that her father Randy sent to Nikki. She would hide them, she would throw them away. She would never actually give them to Nikki. Then there was Shelley's second husband, Danny Long. He was a neighbor of Shelley's, and they eventually got married in June of 1978. By that point, Shelley was already pregnant, and they welcomed their daughter Samantha in August 1978. They moved into Grandma Anna's old house in Battleground, which had been willed to Shelley after Grandma Anna died. Once again, Shelley's second marriage was a total disaster. Danny and Shelley fought constantly. Shelley eventually asked her dad for money so that she could pay for a divorce. So Shelley's now been married twice, has 2 kids, has no job, has no skills, has no education, basically lives off of her dad spoiling her, and really has no prospects. That's where Dave Knotek comes in. Dave was born and raised in Raymond, Washington. His family was incredibly poor, and he graduated from high school in 1971. Dave worked as a logger for about a year before he joined the Navy, where he learned to run heavy equipment while serving in Hawaii and Alaska. After he returned from the Navy, he got a really good job at Weyerhaeuser. Dave and Shelley met in April 1982 in Long Beach, Washington. Of course, Shelley didn't come just by herself. She had daughters Sammy and Nikki, but Dave really liked Sammy and Nikki, and he enjoyed spending time with all 3 of them. When Dave and Shelley met, once again, Shelley was in a financial distress. She couldn't afford the house that her grandma had given her, and so she quit-claimed the house to Dave. He promised he would eventually give it back to her, and it was just a temporary fix. But, of course, the mismanagement of money continued, and eventually the house went into foreclosure. This is where Shelley first starts planting the seeds of control and deception in Dave. Shelley tells Dave that she has cancer. Now, of course, cancer is a super serious thing, and it's never something to be taken lightly, to be joked about, to lie and tell people you have it when you don't. But Dave took Shelley at her word. He didn't think that Shelley would lie about something so extreme, and he was also wanting to be there for the girls. What would happen to them if Shelley died of cancer? Shelley and Dave move in together, they get a house in Raymond, and they get married on December 28th, 1987. But of course, Shelley can't control herself, and the sweet, loving, caring Shelley that Dave initially met quickly fell by the wayside. Shelley was definitely the violent aggressor of the 2. She wanted to control Dave. She had a violent temper, but Dave just couldn't leave her. He was in this constant abuse cycle that we see. She would give him love and affection, and then she'd turn around and go into rage outbursts where she would verbally assault him and physically assault him. At least in Shelley's eyes, it seemed like Dave could never do anything right, which has to be incredibly demoralizing as a man. Eventually, the couple moved into a bigger house with more privacy. And when they made this move, it was like something changed in Shelley. Now she wasn't satisfied just taking her aggression out on Dave. She began turning her attention to the girls, Sammy and Nikki. She would beat them if they did anything wrong in her eyes. And again, this was subjective to her, even if it was something super normal that nobody else would think was wrong. The girls would also tell author Gregg Olsen that Shelley's favorite time to attack them was at night. She loved to surprise the girls while they were sleeping. Part of this is also because Shelley was an insomniac and she just never slept at night. So basically her awake time was in the middle of the night while everybody else is sleeping. So instead of letting her girls sleep, she wakes them up and starts verbally assaulting them, physically assaulting them. And they truly had no idea how and when their mom would be set off and go into these rage outbursts. And unfortunately, like we see a lot of times, the girls just hid their marks and didn't tell anybody what was going on. Michelle used that same abuse cycle with the girls. She would give them love and affection and apologize and say, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it." And then she would turn around and get set off again and go right back into that abuse. Essentially, Shelley just perpetuated drama amongst all of her family members to justify the abuse that she inflicted. She started taking shower privileges away from the girls. They couldn't shower unless they asked permission. She claimed that the water was running low, which made absolutely no sense. But for Shelley, it was really all about control. And despite everything that the girls went through, they remained incredibly close to one another. They really only had each other. Shelley began referring to her punishment as quote unquote wallowing. This was a mix of humiliation and physical pain. Nikki would later tell Gregg Olsen that it was quote a nighttime activity and an all seasons endeavor, end quote. So this meant that her favorite time to engage in this wallowing was at night, but she would also make them wallow when it was freezing outside in the cold of winter and snow was on the ground. And Nikki was the prime target of her mother's abuse. Sammy had somehow decided that she was going to butter up Shelley, and that likely protected her from the severe beatings that Nikki was subject to. But Nikki, she was a fighter, and she wasn't going to take the abuse from her mom lying down. So she spent long periods locked in the basement, and she was subject to the wallowing far more often than Sammy was. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned Shelley's youngest brother, Paul. Paul was in and out of prison. Despite that, he had a girlfriend, and they ended up having a baby together. But Shane's mom was into drugs, and once again, because Paul was in and out of prison, he wasn't really around a lot. So they discussed having Shelley adopt their son, Shane. Shane was a super sweet little boy. He loved heavy metal music and Bon Jovi, and he just had this fun and goofy personality. He was more like a brother to Nikki and Sammy, and they spent a lot of time together. Eventually, he did come to live with Shelley, Dave, and the girls. They moved him into the basement of the house and set up this cozy bedroom with all of his favorite things. And he called Shelley and Dave mom and dad. And this was kind of the dynamic that they set up. This was almost like bringing a brother in for the girls, and he was treated like a member of their family. But unfortunately, that wouldn't last for long. Shane spent most of his time doing chores, and he grew to become very scared of Shelley. She continued torturing Nikki and Shane, and she forced them to stand outside naked, even when there was snow and ice on the ground, and it was freezing cold outside. So shortly after Shane moves in, Shelley gets pregnant again in 1988. She was 34 at this time, and around Christmas time, She announced that her best friend, Kathy Loreno, was going to be moving in with them. She didn't run this by anyone, including her husband, Dave. But Kathy worshipped Shelley. She had been a witness to Dave and Shelley's marriage. She did the girls' hair, and she basically was going to come in and help Shelley while she was pregnant and be a babysitter for Nikki, Sammy, and Shane while she was pregnant and dealing with a newborn baby. Kathy Loreno was born in the summer of 1958, and she moved from California to Washington. She felt like she was stuck in South Bend. She was a people pleaser, and she actually paid the household bills for her mom because she was a giver and just too nice to do anything else. She ended up getting a payout for her father's wrongful death, and she was able to buy a house. But sadly, she lost the house and had to move back in with her mom. She got depressed, she was fired from her job, and financially, she was just drowning. So this is around the time that Shelley offers to take her in, and she can work as the care provider for the kids instead of paying rent for her room and board. Dave was, again, taken aback by this a little bit because he wasn't even consulted, but he was super excited to be a dad. And because he was the sole provider, he often spent a lot of time away from the house. And so I think he rationalized it as someone would be there to help Shelley with the kids, and that was going to be great for them. Tori was born in June of 1989, and Shelley just reveled in the attention she got being a mom of a newborn. But that was about it. She didn't really want to do any of the things that a mother would normally do for a baby, such as changing diapers, feeding the baby. She really just kind of wanted to dress her up as her own little doll and kind of show her off. So initially, when Kathy moved in, she took her babysitting role pretty seriously, and Nick and Shane would say that she became kind of more like a second mom rather than a babysitter. They said she was bossy, and because of the way Kathy saw Shelley interact with the kids, Kathy thought they were really bad kids. In reality, this was just Shelley being Shelley. She got mad at the slightest thing. She would get mad at the drop of a pin. Anything that she saw as a slight in her mind, she would get mad about. But overall, the kids were really good kids. They just were suffering in an abusive household, and they didn't know how to tell people about that. At any rate, after Kathy moved in with Michelle and Dave, she started to kind of fade away. Initially, things were really good. It was that beginning stage of the relationship where there's love and affection and praise, and everything's really happy and good. And then Shelley's true colors come out. At the time, there was this weird dynamic for Nikki and Shane in the house. Once Kathy moved in, they started getting abused less because their mom had a new target to focus on. So on one hand, they were incredibly relieved that their mother had moved on from them. But on the other hand, they knew that Kathy hadn't done anything wrong, and she was an adult. So why was she getting the wrath of Shelley? So Shelley eventually started beating Kathy. She pushed her down the stairs. She started using the same privilege system for Kathy that she'd used on her kids, such as permission to use the bathroom, permission to take a shower. She took Kathy's clothes and pictures and all of the belongings that she had brought when she moved in. She made Kathy do chores naked. Gregg Olsen never really elaborated on these quote-unquote chores that everyone was made to do. It basically sounded like whatever Shelley wanted people to do, she would just make a list and tell them to do it. It really didn't seem like these were legitimate chores. This was just kind of busy work that Shelley wanted people to do so she could control them. And like I mentioned, there was a lot of confusion between Nikki, Shane, and Sammy, the kids, as to why Kathy wouldn't just leave the house once Shelley started treating her this way. In their minds, Kathy was an adult. She could have just left at any time. They didn't quite understand the pattern of abuse that was going on in that relationship. So Shelley eventually started getting her kids involved in helping inflict the punishment. She loved to have somebody do her bidding so she didn't have to do the dirty work herself. Most often, it was Shane that she used to inflict harm on Kathy. But Shelley would also hide Kathy in the closet. She cut Kathy's hair very poorly, which, as a hairdresser, I'm sure just broke Kathy's heart. She made Kathy ride in the trunk whenever they went on family vacations. And I read this one camping trip that they went on. Everybody else slept in a tent, but Shelley made Kathy sleep under the car. And then she made her sleep in the trunk of the car. Not only was there physical and mental abuse, but Shelley was also drugging Kathy. She would give her random pills to take, and Kathy had no idea what she was taking. But because she didn't want to get beat, she basically did as she was told. So Shelley would give her lorazepam, atenolol, Altace, Paxil, and Prozac. And eventually, Shelley moved Kathy to the unfinished basement where Shane was, and they basically slept on opposite sides of the basement. Shelley also got her husband Dave involved in the abuse. She made him push Kathy down the hill in the backyard while she was naked and freezing because there was snow outside. And as soon as Kathy would get up, Shelley would make her walk back up the hill, and the cycle would start all over again. And the kids said the next day when they went out, there was just blood-covered snow all over the hill. And they were absolutely mortified about what was going on. But again, they're kids. They couldn't tell anybody what was happening. So in March of 1991, she made Kathy write this letter to her family so that they would believe that she actually just took off. Kathy's sister said, quote, "The story that was woven seemed plausible." End quote. And they truly wanted to believe that Kathy had found love and happiness. I think everybody wants that for their family. So when you have a letter in your loved one's handwriting that's saying, "Hey, I went off to California with my boyfriend," they kind of take it at face value. And, even though they've never heard of this guy, they really want you to be happy. And so they just really didn't think anything of it at the time. So about a year later, in the summer of 92, Shelley and Dave buy a farmhouse in Raymond. This house was a real step down from where they'd been living before. It was a fixer-upper, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. But the one thing that this property did have was that it was way out in the country. It sat along a river. It sat off of a main road, but it was still private because of the trees. There was 5 acres of property that was mostly fenced, and there were a ton of outbuildings on the property. There was a chicken coop, a tool shed, a barn, a well house, a pump house, and a pole building, which housed their storage, pantry, and freezer. So while the property itself was quite large, the house was tiny. It was 1,600 square feet, had 3 bedrooms, and just 1 bathroom for 7 people. Nikki and Sammy each got their own rooms, and Michelle and Dave had a room that Tori also slept in. With that arrangement, that meant that there weren't enough bedrooms for Shane and Kathy. So Shane slept in Nikki's closet, usually without a mattress, and Kathy was forced to sleep on the living room floor. Beatings continued when they moved houses. Shelley would hose Kathy down outside when she wanted to give her a shower, but instead of using soap to clean her, she would use bleach, which, as we all know, is really not supposed to come in contact with your skin. And so it was incredibly painful for Kathy. And once again, Dave was gone working. He would work during the week and he would only come home on the weekends usually. So he really didn't have an idea of the day-to-day activity that was going on the property. But one weekend he came home and he found Kathy in the pump house on the property. And he was incredibly confused. And so he went and asked Shelley, "Why is Kathy sleeping in the pump house?" And Shelley convinced him that Shane was abusing Kathy. So she had moved her out to the pump house for her own safety, which, again, because he wasn't there all the time, Dave just took her at her word and figured that was the best place for her to be so she didn't get hurt. Kathy continuously tried to escape from the new house. She ran away on several occasions, but Shelley would always find her and bring her back to the house. And just a side note, this pump house that she stayed in was the smallest outbuilding on the property. It was dark and musty and cold. One day, Shane tried to let Kathy out to escape. Shane, Nikki, and Sammy were all terrified that Kathy was going to die. Quote, Kathy just didn't have any fight left. She'd simply given up, end quote. At this point, she was close to death. Her body was bruised and broken, and she could barely walk on her own. Meanwhile, Dave is working 16 hours a day, and so he's really only coming home on weekends. He's drinking tons of coffee. He's taking no-dos, trying to stay awake. He almost fell asleep at the wheel several times. He's just not in a good place physically or mentally. And once again, he just takes Shelley at her word, and he just seems to accept that there's nothing nefarious going on. So after Shane tried to let Kathy escape and she just refused, things went downhill. Shelley found Kathy had taken a shit in a Tupperware container because, again, Shelley literally controlled when Kathy used the bathroom. Shelley decided that waterboarding Kathy was the next level of punishment. She made Dave construct the waterboarding device, and of course she made Dave do the actual waterboarding. Shelley would laugh while Kathy screamed to try to make her stop. The waterboarding only took place on one occasion, but that was more than enough. Shelley eventually resorted to feeding Kathy rotten food. She'd blend it up and tell her it was a smoothie. She made her eat a cup of salt, but none of this was ever reported. Apparently, no one ever heard Kathy's screams. No one ever saw Kathy naked working on the property. Nikki and Shane, who had been the victims of Shelley's abuse before Kathy came to live with them, wanted to help Kathy so badly, but they couldn't. They were so terrified of what their mom might do to them, and they knew that Kathy couldn't help herself because she was so weak. So Kathy started having labored breathing. She couldn't stand up on her own because she was too weak. She was covered in bruises in varying degrees of healing. She'd lost a ton of weight, more than 100 pounds. She would have injuries like falling in the shower where she would have cuts and bruises, and she truly needed medical attention, but Shelley just never took her. Towards the end of her life, Shelley moved Kathy from outside in the pump house to inside the house in a small area of the laundry room. For some reason, she actually gave her a mattress, blankets, and pillows. In July 1994, Kathy started making gurgling sounds in her quote-unquote bedroom, but Shelley just brushed this off. Prior to this, Dave had noticed that one side of Kathy's face was droopy, and she was no longer functioning at a normal cognitive level. But by the time Dave had really caught on to how bad things were, Kathy was in a terrible state. She had vomited all over herself, and she was choking on the vomit to the point where she couldn't breathe. Shelley had just left Kathy in this state for who knows how long before Dave came home. Dave tried performing CPR and thought about calling 911, but he didn't want to get Shelley into trouble and was worried about the trauma it might inflict on the kids. Dave wasn't able to save Kathy. When he told Shelley this, Shelley actually seemed puzzled that Kathy had died, and the kids were hysterical when they found out Kathy was dead. Their worst fears had come true. Shelley took the girls and went to Westport and then came back for Shane. Dave tried to rationalize Kathy's death as an accident, and Shelley told Dave how she wanted to get rid of Kathy's body. There was a fire pit on the property where Kathy's body could be burned without raising too much suspicion. It took more than 5 hours to burn Kathy's body to nothing but ash and bone. Dave then took Kathy's ashes to Washaway Beach and dumped her remains into the ocean. He returned back to the house and burned Kathy's clothes and possessions. Of course, now that Kathy was dead, Shelley needed a cover story to tell people. She made up the story that Kathy had committed suicide, but because of Dave burning the body in the fire pit, she didn't want Kathy's family to know, so she made Nikki and Shane collect the remaining bits of Kathy from the fire pit. Eventually, Shelley realized that she was going to have to come up with a better story for Kathy's death. The suicide angle just wasn't going to work. So Shelley went back to the story that Kathy ran away with her boyfriend, Rocky. She put together cards and letters and said that Kathy and Rocky were traveling. And then she made Nikki forge Kathy's signature on the cards. She told Dave to go to Canada and mail out the letters. She had this elaborate plan for covering up Kathy's death. And then, as a backup plan, she was just going to blame Shane for Kathy's death. Basically, she'd do whatever it took to save herself. Shelley even called Kathy's mom to see if she'd be a threat, and Kathy's mom had zero interest in seeing or talking to Kathy. Unfortunately, after Kathy died, Shelley reverted back to abusing Nikki and Shane. But several months later, in February 1995, Shane suddenly disappeared. He talked about running away even more frequently after Kathy died. Had he finally escaped? Shelley would tell the girls a few weeks later that Shane was fishing on Kodiak Island in Alaska. With Shane and Kathy gone, Nikki was all alone in her abuse and torture. She was the favorite target of her mother. Shelley banished Nikki to the outbuildings in the woods behind the property. Most of the time, she made her stay out there naked. Once, she cut Nikki in the leg so bad, she left a 2-inch gash in her leg. Nikki was so fed up with the abuse and torture, she tried to kill herself in the barn. She made a noose using hay bale twine. Fortunately, the beam Nikki had chosen snapped and broke, so she couldn't hang herself. So this whole time, Shelley hasn't had a job, which honestly makes sense why she tortured the kids and Kathy. She basically had nothing better to do. But in September of 1996, Shelley applied to be a teacher's aide in the South Bend School District. I couldn't tell if she actually got this job. Probably not, because she does keep abusing the kids. But Sammy, for her part, had found a way to kind of deal with the abuse that she suffered. She had seemingly good friends who knew that her mother was crazy. Her friends didn't even know that she had a sister named Nikki because they never saw her, even though she was always outside working on quote-unquote chores for her mother. But the thing is, once Shane and Kathy were gone, Shelley refused to allow Sammy and Nikki to become close to one another. She didn't want them talking to each other or hanging out for fear that they would conspire against her. And again, Dave still wasn't around. He was working on Whidbey Island, and he just sent his money home each week. Unfortunately for Shelley, not everyone could just forget about Shane and Kathy like she could. Her stepmother Laura would call to check on Shane, and Shelley always had an excuse for why he couldn't come to the phone. Instead, Shelley complained about how much of a handful Shane was. But Laura continued sending checks for Shane's birthday and Christmas, and these checks were cashed. Shelley finally told Laura that Shane was in Alaska working on a fishing boat. Laura tried to push back on this, but Shelley was insistent that fishing was Shane's dream and that he was happy in Alaska. But this just didn't make sense to Laura. She knew her grandson, and she knew that fishing on a boat wasn't his dream. Nikki graduated from high school in 1993. She enrolled in Grays Harbor Community College. But sadly, Shelley began chipping away at the life Nikki wanted to create for herself. Shelley would take away her nice clothes that she'd wear to school. She banished her to the living room floor, the same floor Kathy had slept on, and she took away Nikki's money so she couldn't get to school. Slowly, Nikki realized she would never get out of Raymond. She felt like she'd be stuck there forever with her mom. Thankfully, Nikki began fighting back. She was 19 at the time and no longer a small child who would be forced to put up with the abuse and torment of her mother. Shelley sent Nikki to stay with her sister-in-law, Trish, in Hope, British Columbia. This was about 4 hours away from where they were living at the time. Nikki stayed for several months, and she helped Trish with her cleaning job. Nikki was finally happy, and she felt normal again. Trish tried desperately to keep Nikki with her, but Shelley always got what she wanted. So Nikki went back home to Washington. But when she initially came back, she stayed with Dave on Whidbey Island. And she saw how Dave was actually living. He had no money. They received food from donation boxes and lived in a tent on the job site. But at least Nikki was able to shower every day. Nikki eventually got a job at the Oak Harbor Baskin Robbins and another job cleaning motel rooms. Her boss at the motel gave her a trailer to stay in. She was finally free of her mother for a little while. After Nikki left for BC, Sammy started to grow tired of covering up the abuse she was suffering at home. She started telling her teachers, and the school counselor told her they'd be reporting the abuse to the authorities. But Sammy panicked. She'd been abused for so long and was so scared of what her mother would do. She told the counselor that she lied and made everything up. And of course, Dave was no help. He was in complete denial about the abuse. He blindly believed Shelley to a fault. He didn't think it was possible for her to mistreat the girls. She loved them. Sammy graduated from high school in summer of 1997, and she was ready to get the hell away from her mother. She wanted a life outside of Raymond. She dreamed of going to college just like her sister. She stayed with her grandma Laura in Bellingham for the summer, and just like Nikki, Sammy finally felt normal and happy. Nikki even came to stay with Laura around the same time because she wanted to get a job in Bellingham, far away from her mother. But unfortunately, she wasn't completely free. Shelley made Dave follow Nikki around Bellingham and made several anonymous calls to the nursing home that Nikki worked at, complaining about Nikki's interactions with patients. Sammy actually blackmailed her mother. She told her that she wouldn't tell anyone about the abuse because Sammy wanted her mother to let her go to college and fill out the paperwork she needed for financial aid. And Shelley actually did this. So Sammy and Nikki are growing up, and it's just Tori left at home with Shelley. Shelley decides to take Dave off their shared checking account, but she continued depositing his paychecks. He never saw that money or how it was spent. Shelley took out over $36,000 in personal loans, and all this money was used to fund Shelley's shopping addiction. She would write checks around town, and they would often bounce, and then her account would be overdrawn. But she'd just open new accounts. She even withdrew money from her daughter's accounts, even though she wasn't an authorized user of the account. With Sammy and Nikki gone, Tori, who had been shielded from abuse for most of her life, soon found herself in her mother's crosshairs for no reason other than she was the only one left. Sammy remained close to Nikki and Tori, but Tori and Nikki's relationship was strained. Shelley kept perpetuating that Nikki was a terrible person and Tori shouldn't be close to her and she was a bad influence. Finally, for the first time in her long marriage to Dave, Shelley got a job as a caseworker in Raymond. At this new job, Shelley met Ron Woodworth. He'd helped her find homes for a bunch of cats that were rescued from one of Shelley's clients' homes. Ron loved cats and had a bunch of his own. He lived in a trailer, and he was unemployed when he met Shelley. Sam and Tori really liked Ron. They even called him Uncle Ron. Ron had moved to South Bend in 1992 with his partner Gary. They'd been together about 17 years, and both had family in the area. But Ron's father died in June 1996, and his behavior changed after that. He became unemployed and was introverted and sullen. Eventually, Ron and Gary broke up in 1997. He never saw or spoke to Gary again. In 1999, Ron spoke to a friend about moving in with Shelley and Dave because they planned to buy a house in Oak Harbor. But by July of 2000, Ron hadn't moved to Oak Harbor and he wasn't doing well financially. He borrowed money to pay a lawyer for trailer space issues he was having. Supposedly, Shelley was going to get him a lawyer and took $1,000 from him. But it's unclear if she actually got him a lawyer. Ron had to briefly live with his mom, and he lost all of his cats. He was devastated. Ron did eventually move in with the Knotek family, and he stayed in Sammy's old bedroom, but it didn't take long for Shelley to start her abuse. Once again, with Ron as the subject of Shelley's torture, Tori didn't get it as much. Shelley beat Ron and started giving him the same cocktail of drugs she fed Kathy. She started giving Ron bathroom privileges, took away his bedroom, and made him do chores outside. While all this was going on behind the scenes, Shelley was barely holding on to her job. She was described as defiant and erratic. She'd received 2 write-ups. She would delete voicemails for the company, and she made Ron write letters of support from him and his mother after a poor performance evaluation in January of 2001. In March, she received a written warning and was notified that it was possible she'd be terminated. In May, she was placed on probation, but by June, she was given a severance check and she was terminated. Ron's friend tried to get him out of Shelley's grasp, but it was too late. Shelley had a hold on him and she wouldn't be letting him go. Shelley, like all typical abusers, pushed Ron away from his family, isolating him so that she was all he had. She made Ron write letters to his family, berating them for perceived mistreatment. He blamed his mother for why he lost his cats and told his brother that their mother was a traitor. Ron told his family he was moving to Seattle and all future communication would go through Shelley. The last letter Ron wrote to his mother, dated October 9th, 2001, read, quote, "Madam, this is to inform you that I am giving Mrs. Michelle Knotek permission to remove all my personal property from your home and storage building. What she does with it is none of your business. Once she has removed everything, you will receive no more communication from me. I pray that you will live for 100 years in perfect health, both physically and mentally, and that for every day of the rest of your life, you will remember the cruelty of what you did to me. You are now their responsibility, not mine. I was once your loving son." End quote. While all this is going on in Shelley's house, Nikki moves to Oregon with her step-grandma. While there, she confessed to her grandmother that Shelley and Dave killed Kathy, and Laura had no reason not to believe what Nikki was telling her. She knew her stepdaughter. In July of 2001, Laura faxed Nikki's statement to the Pacific County Sheriff's Office. This included details of Kathy's death, including Shelley's poisoning her with pills. After this confession, Nikki moved back to Bellingham. She called Sammy to give her the heads up about what she'd done. And that's when Nikki also told Sammy that she thought Shelley had killed Shane too. Police made welfare checks over the past several months in response to calls from Kathy's family. Police tried to follow up with Sammy after Nikki's report, but she never called them back. The abuse of Ron continued. Shelley forced him to listen to messages from his family without a single care in the world. She'd continue to stir shit up between Ron and his family, forcing Ron to keep writing truly nasty letters to his mother. Shelley eventually took away Ron's clothes and forced him to work out in the yard naked. She told him he didn't deserve clothes, which of course made no sense to anyone but Shelley. Even though there was actually a bed and a bedroom available for Ron, Shelley made him sleep on the floor. And because Shelley was a truly horrible woman and saw how close Tori and Ron were, she made Ron tell Tori he didn't love her anymore, and she told Ron he couldn't talk to Tori anymore. She didn't want them to have any kind of relationship, but Ron still slept just outside Tori's bedroom door at night. Tori would sneak little hugs and smiles with Ron when she could. But as much as Tori loved Ron, she didn't want to do anything that would make her mom hurt Ron further, so she tried her best to keep her distance. Sammy had met Ron a couple occasions when she would come home from college, and she eventually saw a decline in Ron's appearance. He was disheveled and a, quote, shell of a man, end quote. This wasn't the same Ron she met the first time. She knew that the same thing was happening to Ron that happened to Kathy. Even Dave said that he saw Ron deteriorating when he'd come home from his weekend visits. Like Kathy, Ron tried to run away a few times, but he really had nowhere to go, and he always went back to the Knotek family. Although she stopped working for the caregiving agency, Shelley did get a private, independent caregiving job, taking care of James McClintock, who was a friend of Kathy Loreno's mother. James also had a black lab named Sissy. Shelley used Ron to help take care of James. She even moved Ron into his house. Somehow, Ron was more available to take care of James than Shelley, even though Shelley was unemployed and didn't do anything except torture people. Shelley set Ron up in the basement, even though James had several spare bedrooms available. Shelley still controlled Ron, even when he wasn't living with her. In September 2001, James signed over power of attorney to Shelley. Once again, Dave took Shelley at her word about Ron's alleged bad behaviors and took to beating him on Shelley's behalf. Shelley would make Ron drink his own urine when she found cups he used to go to the bathroom because she wouldn't allow him to do so. In February of 2002, James passed away. Shelley received $5,000 and his dog. Shelley would have to wait to inherit James's house worth $140,000 because his will said that she would only receive this upon Sissy's death. The details of James's cause of death were a little vague. Supposedly, Ron called 911 to say James fell and hit his head. The coroner later confirmed that James died of a subdural hematoma caused by blunt trauma to the head, possibly caused by a fall, but the coroner couldn't be definitive. And of course, Shelley, being the crazy person she is, accused Ron of killing James. She said it so much that Ron eventually believed it. Shelley would later tell Tori that Ron let James fall out of his wheelchair and, quote, waited too long, end quote, to call 911. Shelley inheriting James's house was the beginning of the end for her. Neighbors were concerned about how and why she'd gotten the house. Was it legal? In spring of 2003, the Pacific County Sheriffs went to the Knotek residence to serve a restraining order against Ron. On April 18th, just a few days after the restraining order had been served, Shelley received an anonymous letter in the mail. Quote, "Like the Lord Jesus Christ, Kathy also arose from the dead and is back to revenge you, ashes to ashes." End quote. Shelley had no idea who sent it, but she started spiraling. At this point, it seemed like the torture and abuse of Ron was ramped up. He fell off the roof repeatedly, and on another occasion, Shelley actually made him jump off the roof for her own personal pleasure. Shelley and Dave burned Ron's feet with hot water and bleach, and Tori said it smelled like decomposing flesh. Dave had tried to get Ron to leave, but Ron, like Kathy, refused. One day in July 2003, Ron just disappeared. Shelley had laid the groundwork for Ron having committed suicide to Dave, but she told Tori that Ron had left and moved to Tacoma. When Dave called later that day, Shelley told him that she found Ron dead on the back porch. She then wrapped his body in sleeping bags and stuffed the body into a freezer. When Dave got home, he knew he had to help Shelley get rid of Ron's body. But there was a burn ban in effect, so he couldn't burn Ron's body like he had Kathy's. So Dave decided to bury Ron's body. On August 6, 2003, Nikki and Sammy both went to the Pacific County Sheriff's Office. They told them their story, and they were believed. Prosecutor staff even came to the meeting. They wanted to save their sister Tori, and they wanted to see their parents prosecuted. Tori was removed from the Knotek house and provided her statement to investigators. Before police could come to him, Dave went to the police and gave his statement. He told police where he'd buried Ron's body and where he'd disposed of Kathy's remains. He didn't admit to anything else with Kathy and Ron, and he didn't throw Shelley under the bus. But Dave would also confess to murdering Shane. Quote, "Shane's in the ocean," end quote, is what he told them. He said they fought over a gun and it went off, and he claimed that he was too scared to call police. But Nikki had a different story. Shane had hidden 3 Polaroids of Kathy inside a teddy bear. These pictures showed Kathy naked with bruises covering her body. Shane told Nikki that he'd stolen the pictures from Shelley. For some reason, Nikki decided to tell Shelley that Shane had these pictures. She felt guilty every day for ratting him out. Dave confronted Shane about the photos, but they were never found. In February of 1995, Dave admitted to shooting Shane in the back of his head with a .22 caliber gun. He then burned Shane's body, took the ashes, and dumped them into the ocean at Washaway Beach. He buried the gun used to kill Shane, then burned it, and when the entirety of the gun didn't burn, he hid it in the house. In February 2004, Dave pled guilty to second-degree murder for Shane and also pled guilty to unlawful disposal of human remains and rendering criminal assistance. He wouldn't testify against Shelley. Unfortunately, prosecutors couldn't make first-degree murder charges stick for Shelley. It was a no-body homicide for Kathy, and they couldn't definitively determine Ron's cause of death. So on June 18, 2004, Michelle entered an Alford plea. In her Alford plea, she would receive 13.5 years for the murder of Kathy and 8.5 years for the manslaughter of Ron. But at Shelley's sentencing, she continued to point fingers at everyone else. She, of course, took no responsibility for her actions. And because of that, the judge decided to increase her sentence to 22 years. Shelley is set for possible release in June of 2002. But because she hasn't shown any remorse and continues to blame everyone but herself, it's unlikely that she'll receive parole. Dave was released in 2016 and now lives on the Washington coast. He works at a seafood processing plant and still has a relationship with Tori and Sammy, but not Nikki. All 3 girls remain close and they see each other frequently. And that is the terrible story of Michelle Knotek. Thank you so much for listening to episode 25. And thank you so much for listening for the past year. We've enjoyed creating this content for you and can't wait to keep providing content in the future. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe and leave a review if you like the show. You can email case suggestions or comments to truecrimecatLawyer@gmail.com. The links for our social media pages are included in the show notes. You can find our discussion group on Facebook by searching for True Crime Cat Lawyer in the group section. And if you want more content, head over to Patreon to join one of our available tiers. You can get monthly mini and bonus episodes as well as early access to our main episodes. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about my co-host, You can check out her Instagram at Winston the Cat PDX. Thanks again for listening and stay tuned for our next episode.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com. See you next time.